I had seen the CEO angry before, but never in a way that made the air feel as though it had thickened into something heavy and dangerous. Never in a way that made my pulse tighten, as if my body were preparing for impact. And certainly never in a way that made me question whether the man I had worked beside for years was still capable of distinguishing authority from cruelty. Yet the moment he screamed at the janitor, the entire floor froze in disbelief so complete that it felt as if time itself had been interrupted, caught between one breath and the next, allowing the shock to settle into every corner of the office with a suffocating stillness. I had arrived early that morning, moving through the quiet corridors with the familiar rhythm of someone who had spent years learning the pulse of the building. And although I sensed the CEO's frustration brewing long before the explosion happened, I never imagined it would erupt with such force, because anger from him was usually cold and sharp, delivered through clipped phrases or a single disapproving glance that communicated more than shouting ever could. And yet on this day, something inside him snapped with a violence that even I, who had witnessed him dismantle high-ranking executives without raising his voice, was not prepared to witness. The janitor, an older man with gentle shoulders and eyes that always seemed to carry a quiet resignation, had been cleaning the edge of the hallway near the conference room when the CEO stormed toward him. And although I was too far away to hear the first words that left his mouth, I saw the janitor flinch as if struck by something heavy, his gloved hands tightening around the handle of his mop, as though he were bracing himself against a storm he had no power to outrun. By the time I reached them, the CEO's voice had risen to a furious pitch that reverberated through the polished walls, each word slicing through the calm atmosphere of the morning like a blade drawn without warning. He accused the janitor of incompetence, negligence, carelessness, his accusations escalating with an intensity that made several staff members retreat behind cubicle walls while pretending to focus on their screens, though their eyes flickered sideways with the need to witness something they understood they were not supposed to watch. The humiliation unfolding in the center of the hallway felt brutal, almost intimate in its cruelty, as if the CEO were not merely expressing frustration, but tearing into an old wound inside himself, using the janitor as a vessel for a deeper anger that had been simmering far beneath the surface of his polished authority. And the janitor, unable or unwilling to defend himself, simply stood with his back slightly bowed, absorbing every verbal blow with a silence that was far more painful to witness than any defiance would have been. The fear in the room was not loud, not chaotic. It was quiet, seeped into the floor like spilled ink, spreading through. Each employee who dared not move or speak, because everyone knew that crossing the CEO in moments like this was an invitation to become the next target. And yet none of us could look away completely, drawn by the collision of power and vulnerability happening just a few steps from our desks. What struck me hardest, however, was not the rage itself, but the expression on the janitor's face. An expression that held no anger, no defensiveness, not even surprise, but a deep, quiet pain that seemed to suggest he had endured this kind of humiliation before, perhaps many times. Perhaps enough that he no longer expected dignity in the presence of people who looked at him and saw only a uniform and a low-ranking title rather than a human being carrying burdens no one cared to understand. As the CEO continued to shout, his gestures growing sharper and his breathing heavier, I found myself stepping slightly closer, not because I believed I had any authority to intervene, but because something about the scene felt profoundly wrong, as though the balance of power had shifted into a place that violated the unspoken rules of decency. Even in a cutthroat corporate environment where emotions were treated as liabilities and hierarchies were reinforced with relentless precision. I noticed several employees pretending to type, their fingers unmoving above their keyboards, their attention fixed on the confrontation while their bodies remained frozen in positions meant to suggest work. Others lingered at corners, half hidden, watching with wide eyes that reflected both fear and a kind of terrible fascination, because witnessing the downfall of an authority figure is one thing, but witnessing a powerful man attack someone defenseless creates a darker, more unsettling reaction that people rarely admit aloud. The janitor's silence made the CEO's rant feel even louder, each accusation echoing through a void the older man refused to fill. And as I watched him lower his eyes with the kind of weary acceptance that only comes from years of being underestimated, something within me tightened, a mix of anger and helplessness that made my throat constrict, because there was a dignity in the janitor's stillness that the CEO's rage could not touch, no matter how vicious the words became. Eventually, the CEO exhaled sharply, as though emptying his lungs of the final remnants of whatever storm had taken hold of him. And when he turned away, his shoulders stiff and his jaw locked beneath the weight of emotions he refused to acknowledge, the room remained suspended in its unnatural quiet, as if no one dared breathe until he was safely out of sight. But just as the CEO took his first step forward, ready to leave behind the scene of the damage he had inflicted, a young girl stepped out from behind the corner. Small, determined, and unexpectedly brave, and the entire room changed. Everyone feared him, but only a few of us knew why his anger always felt like a loaded weapon, ready to explode, why even the smallest misstep in his presence felt like stepping onto a minefield laid carefully by a man who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional control so strict that it bordered on cruelty. And I learned early in my career that working for him meant carrying the constant awareness that one wrong breath could trigger a response none of us were prepared to handle. The CEO had not risen to power through charm or mentorship or the kind of leadership that inspires loyalty. He built his empire through a kind of ruthless efficiency that demanded perfection from everyone around him, while allowing no one to see the cracks in his own armor. And the higher he climbed, the colder he became, as if success had stripped away the last remnants of softness he might have carried from a life before the boardroom devoured him. He came from nothing, or at least that was the story whispered through the halls by those who tried to understand him. And although he rarely spoke about his past, the fragments that surfaced suggested a childhood defined by instability, scarcity, and a constant need to prove himself, shaping a man who believed that survival depended not on collaboration, but on dominance, on always staying one step ahead, on crushing any obstacle, human or otherwise, that dared to stand in his way. His management style followed the same pattern. He demanded absolute precision, absolute punctuality, absolute obedience, and those who failed to meet his expectations found themselves facing consequences so swift and severe that most employees learned to fear him long before they ever interacted with him directly, because stories of his temper circulated faster than any memo, creating an atmosphere where people moved with unnatural caution, speaking softly, typing quietly, and praying silently that they would not be the next person to disappoint him. For years, I watched him transform the company into a machine that reflected his own worldview. Impressive, powerful, efficient, but drained of warmth, drained of empathy, drained of anything resembling humanity. And the deeper I stepped into his circle of trust, the more I understood that his authority did not stem from charisma, but from intimidation so expertly crafted that even the most confident executives found their voices trembling when presenting to him. Working beside him meant learning to read the smallest shifts in his expression, because the difference between a neutral nod and a tightened jaw could determine whether a project succeeded or whether someone's career quietly ended before lunch. And over time, I developed an instinct for anticipating his moods before they surfaced, adjusting schedules, filtering information, and removing anything that might ignite the explosive anger he tried so desperately to hide beneath his controlled exterior. He believed weakness should be punished, not corrected, and this belief seeped into every corner of the building, shaping a culture where employees hid their mistakes instead of learning from them, where fear replaced innovation, and where vulnerability became a liability so dangerous that people forgot they were allowed to be human. Because the CEO had built a world where emotions were defects and hesitation was crime, and I sometimes wondered if he had shaped the company in the image of his own emotional scars, unacknowledged, unforgiven, unhealed. Despite all of this, there were rare moments, fragile, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when I caught glimpses of a different man behind the one the world feared, moments when his eyes softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again, or when his voice faltered in a way that suggested he was not as invincible as he wanted us to believe. And although those moments passed quickly, they left behind a lingering sense that his rage was not born from arrogance, but from something far older, far more painful, and far more deeply buried than anyone dared to imagine. I often wondered what he carried inside him, what memory or guilt or fear twisted itself into his spine so tightly that the only way he knew how to release pressure was through anger. And although he never confided in me willingly, I sensed that behind every harsh order and every cutting remark was a man who had never learned how to process hurt without turning it into a weapon, because somewhere in his past, he must have discovered that showing pain only invited more of it. Yet, with all the time I spent at his side, with all the secrets I witnessed, with all the patterns I learned to decode, nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment when the little girl opened her mouth and spoke, because in that instant, I saw something in the CEO's face that I had never seen before. Something so raw and so terrifying that I realized his anger was only the surface of a much deeper truth he had spent his entire life fighting to keep hidden. Yet nothing about him prepared me for his reaction when the girl spoke. She looked far too small, far too gentle to interrupt a man like him. Yet she stood there with a determination that stunned us all, as if she had walked straight into the storm, knowing it could swallow her whole, but refusing to take even a single step back. And the moment her tiny frame appeared in the hallway, the air shifted in a way that made every person present draw a silent breath without understanding why. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, a child with soft, tangled hair that fell loosely around her shoulders in strands that looked untouched by any brush that morning. And her face, though smudged faintly with the dust of a long walk, held a kind of purity that didn't belong in a place built on deadlines, pressure, and fear. Her eyes were wide and dark, carrying a depth that felt almost unsettling in a girl so young, not because she seemed frightened, but because she seemed to see everything, the cruelty, the imbalance, the injustice, more clearly than the adults who towered above her. She wore a simple dress, faded around the edges and slightly too big for her frame, the kind of clothing that suggested someone had chosen functionality over fit, perhaps because it was all they could afford, and her shoes were worn down at the heels, their soles frayed as though they had traveled far more miles than any child her age should have had to walk. There was nothing about her appearance that matched the polished atmosphere of the building, yet she carried herself with a quiet steadiness, a strange mixture of innocence and resolve, as if she were standing exactly where she believed she needed to be, even if no one else understood why. She entered the scene so quietly that at first I thought she was simply wandering, a lost child who had somehow been separated from a parent or guardian. But then she took a step closer to the CEO, and the moment she did, the janitor's head snapped up with such sudden alarm that I felt his fear strike me like a blow, because the expression that crossed his face was not merely shock. It was panic, raw and immediate, as though he recognized her and knew she was about to do something he couldn't stop. The janitor's eyes widened, his breath caught as though trapped in his chest, and he shook his head almost imperceptibly, a silent plea for the girl to stay back, to leave the CEO's path untouched. But she didn't see it, or didn't care, because she continued moving forward with small, purposeful steps that made the room grow unbearably still. Around us, staff members who had been pretending to work moments earlier began whispering, their voices low and urgent, carrying notes of confusion and concern that blended into a nervous hum across the hallway. People leaned forward in their seats or peeked around corners, unsure whether they should intervene, unsure whether the girl belonged to someone, unsure whether they should fetch security, yet too captivated by the unfolding moment to pull themselves away. I felt the tension rising with every inch she closed between herself and the CEO, because this was not a man anyone approached lightly, not even adults with titles and authority and experience, and the idea of a fragile child standing in front of him felt almost surreal, as if the universe had suddenly decided to place innocence directly in the path of power to see which force would break first. Her presence contradicted everything the hallway had become moments earlier, and in that contradiction lay a strange, consuming silence, because where humiliation, rage, and fear had dominated only seconds before, now there was a stillness filled with expectation, as though every single person in the building sensed that something irreversible was about to happen, something that would not allow the morning to return to its ordinary rhythm once it unfolded. She stopped only a few feet away from him, her chin lifting with a quiet defiance that contrasted sharply with the tremble of her small fingers at her sides, revealing that even if she was afraid, she had pushed that fear aside with a force far greater than her size. The CEO, still stiff from the remnants of his rage, turned his head toward her slowly, perhaps expecting another employee, perhaps expecting an apology, perhaps expecting nothing at all, but certainly not expecting to be confronted by a child who looked at him with an intensity that neither hatred nor judgment could explain. For a long heartbeat, the two of them simply stared at each other, one a towering figure wrapped in authority, and the other a fragile silhouette wrapped in quiet courage. And in that suspended moment, I felt something shift, not in the building but in the CEO himself, as if the sight of her struck a part of him he had long forgotten existed, a part he never allowed anyone to reach because it was the most vulnerable place he carried. I saw the janitor take a half-step forward, his lips parting in silent protest, but the girl lifted her hand slightly, almost instinctively, as if asking him not to interfere, and something about that gesture, gentle yet commanding, hushed the entire room even further, until the silence felt almost sacred, as though we were all witnessing the opening line of a story none of us had known we were standing in. And then she finally spoke, softly, steadily, impossibly brave, and said something no one in the room could believe. Her voice was soft, almost too soft for a room still vibrating with the echo of the CEO's anger. Yet the moment she spoke, the color drained from his face so quickly and so completely that it felt as though she had reached into his past and pulled out a secret he had spent years burying beneath layers of authority, wealth, and intimidation. And for a moment, I genuinely wondered if I had misheard her, because nothing about her childish tone matched the devastation that rippled through him the instant her words filled the air. It happened in a single fragile breath. She lifted her chin, met his eyes without fear, and said something so unexpected, so quietly devastating, that the hallway turned into a cavern of stunned silence, every whisper dying mid-air, every step halting as though the building itself understood that whatever just came out of her mouth had the power to unravel the man we all believed was unbreakable. At first, no one reacted, not because her words lacked weight, but because the shock was so immense that our minds refused to process it quickly enough. It was as if time had stretched, slowed, and wrapped itself around a moment too significant to let pass without making us all feel the gravity of it. Then, gradually, I heard chairs creak behind office doors as people leaned closer, saw shadows gathering at the corners of the hallway where employees peeked around partitions, their expressions etched with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for witnessing a truth no one was ever meant to hear. I watched the staff's reactions unfold like a wave. Wide eyes, parted lips, stiffened posture, hands frozen mid-gesture, as though each person had been hit by the same invisible blow, each one trying to understand how a child could speak words that carried so much emotional force. They could stop the most feared man in the building from breathing normally. The CEO, who only moments ago had been red with fury and vibrating with the arrogance of someone accustomed to absolute control, shifted from anger to shock so abruptly it felt like witnessing a tower collapse. Slow at first, then all at once, his expression tightening as though he had been struck directly in the chest, the rage in his eyes extinguishing into something far more fragile, fear, recognition, and a pain he clearly did not want anyone in that hallway to see. His jaw slackened. His hand, still clenched from shouting, loosened around the sleeve of his custom-tailored suit. His shoulders, normally rigid with confidence, dipped just slightly, as though the weight of her words had pressed down on him with the force of a memory he had fought for years to keep buried. He stared at her with an intensity so raw that I felt my breath catch, because whatever she had said, whatever those words carried, had pierced straight through the armor he had worn for as long as I had known him. My emotional confusion rose like a tidal swell, overwhelming and disorienting, because I had no possible way to understand how a single sentence from a small girl could destroy the certainty of a man who built an entire legacy on invulnerability. I felt my pulse stutter as I looked back and forth between them, searching her innocent face for clues and his collapsing expression for answers, but neither offered anything comprehensible. Instead, I felt the strange chill of being pulled into a story much larger than the confrontation I had expected to witness when he first began screaming. The girl didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there holding his gaze with the calmness of someone who had delivered a truth she believed he needed to hear, even if it cracked open wounds she couldn't possibly understand. And the more I looked at her, the more I realized she hadn't spoken impulsively. She had spoken with purpose, as though someone had once told her that these words belonged to him, and only him. And then, the second the CEO swallowed hard and took a step back, recoiling as though touched by a ghost, something inside me twisted painfully because a distant memory surfaced, uninvited, unwelcome, but unmistakable. The memory of a night when I accidentally overheard him confess something he never intended anyone to know, a confession filled with the same trembling phrase the girl had just spoken aloud. And that was the moment I understood, with a coldness that seeped into my bones, that the words she said matched something I once overheard in the CEO's darkest confession. It wasn't the girl's defiance that broke him. It was the memory her words dragged out from inside him, a memory so deeply buried beneath the steel layers of authority he had wrapped around himself that I truly believed nothing in this world could ever force it back into the light. And yet the moment her small voice echoed through that hallway, something inside him shattered with a force that seemed almost physical, as though the past he had spent his entire life outrunning had reached out and seized him by the throat. At first, he didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at the girl as if she had spoken in a language only he understood, a language that pulled at the softest, most hidden corner of his heart. And the more he tried to steady himself, the more obvious it became that he was losing control of a battle he had spent decades pretending he had already won. His hands, usually firm and commanding, began to tremble with a subtle, involuntary weakness that startled me more than his earlier rage ever had. And when he lifted one of them to press against his chest, his fingers shook as though they were struggling under the weight of something far heavier than emotion, something closer to grief. His voice, once sharp enough to silence an entire boardroom, caught in his throat before a single word escaped, breaking into a fractured sound that felt foreign coming from a man known for speaking with such confidence that even his pauses carried authority. And as he tried again to form a response, the strain in his voice deepened until it cracked entirely, revealing a kind of vulnerability I had never imagined he possessed. The transformation happening before our eyes was not dramatic in volume, but devastating in its quietness. The collapse of a man who had refused, for as long as I had known him, to allow himself even one moment of emotional softness. And yet here he was, trembling beneath the weight of a child's words, his breath unsteady, his eyes unfocused, his composure dissolving like sand slipping through fingers he could no longer control. The janitor, who had moments earlier stood frozen in humiliation, took a hesitant step forward, his body tilting as if instinct pushed him toward the CEO in spite of fear. Yet something stopped him. Perhaps the shock of seeing power unravel. Perhaps the uncertainty of whether his presence would help or worsen the moment. Or perhaps the fear that his involvement might ignite a new storm that neither of them was ready to face. His hand lifted slightly, then lowered again, and I saw a flicker of sorrow pass between him and the girl, as though the two of them shared a silent understanding that the man collapsing before us was crumbling under a wound neither of them had intended to expose. I stepped forward before I even realized what I was doing, driven by instinct more than duty, because although I had spent years bracing myself against the ceaseless demands of his perfectionism, I had never witnessed him look so lost, so stripped of the identity he clung to, and I couldn't simply stand still while he unraveled in a room full of people who had only known him as a force of intimidation. His breath faltered again as I reached him, and when I gently touched his arm, I felt the tremor running through him. Not the kind that comes from fear of external threats, but the kind born from confronting a memory that tears open the oldest scar inside a person. He leaned ever so slightly into my touch, not for support in the physical sense, but as though he were trying to anchor himself in the present moment before the past swallowed him whole, and I whispered his name quietly, hoping the familiarity of it would ground him. But instead of responding, his gaze drifted downward, unfocused, watery, as if he were seeing not the hallway or the staff or the girl, but a piece of his life he had never allowed to surface. His breathing turned shallow, trembling, and when he finally parted his lips, the sound that escaped was not composed or controlled. It was a soft, fractured whisper, a sound that vibrated with despair, guilt, and a longing he had denied for far too long. And I felt something inside my own chest tighten in response, because I knew, without needing him to say anything, that whatever memory had resurfaced was far more painful than anger could ever mask. Around us, the staff stood frozen in a stunned silence so complete that the air felt heavy with anticipation. And I knew they were seeing a version of him none of them would ever forget. The version of a man who had spent years building a fortress around himself, only to have it dismantled in seconds by a truth he never anticipated confronting. Yet no one dared move. No one even dared exhale too loudly, because the atmosphere had shifted into something sacred and fragile, the kind of moment that could break if touched in the wrong way. I tightened my grip on his arm, steadying him as best as I could, and whispered again, asking if he needed to sit, if he needed help, if he needed anything at all. But he only shook his head with a trembling breath, as though admitting any vulnerability would destroy the last piece of himself he was trying desperately to hold together. His eyes glistened, unfocused, drifting somewhere far beyond the walls around us, and the more I watched him fight for composure, the more I realized that no amount of discipline could shield him from the truth he had spent so long burying. Then, with another ragged exhale, he closed his eyes as if surrendering for just a moment, and when he opened them again, he whispered a name soaked in pain, memory, and loss, a name I never expected him to say out loud. In that moment, I realized the CEO wasn't angry. He was haunted in a way that made his rage seem suddenly small compared to the storm that had just risen inside him. And as he whispered that name with a trembling that seemed to come from a place far deeper than fear, I understood with chilling clarity that we were not witnessing the collapse of a powerful man, but the return of a ghost he had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun. The name he spoke did not belong to anyone in the building, nor to any executive, nor to any rival whose memory might still irritate him. It carried the softness of childhood, the kind of name whispered in dark rooms during storms, the kind of name a boy clings to long before he learns what the world expects him to become. And although I had never heard him utter it publicly, the rawness in his voice told me instantly that this person had shaped him in a way no mentor or accomplishment ever could. Shaping him not through guidance, but through emotion he had long ago forbidden himself to feel. As he stood shaking in front of the girl, fragments of the story he had once confessed, late at night, half drunk, unaware that anyone could hear him, flashed through my mind, and I pieced together what I had only half understood back then. He had grown up in a small, unstable home, where affection was scarce and safety was unpredictable, where responsibilities fell onto him long before he was old enough to carry them. And in the middle of that harsh environment existed one person who softened the sharp edges of his world. This person, someone younger, someone he felt responsible for, someone who looked up to him with the kind of trust that can either save a child or destroy them, had been the emotional anchor of his early life, the only soul who saw him not as a problem to fix or a burden to carry, but as a protector, a comfort, a source of warmth in a world that offered so little of it. They shared everything: whispered secrets, long nights spent listening to the chaos around them, small moments of joy carved out of circumstances that forced them to grow faster than any child should. But trauma has a way of stealing even the few things that keep a person afloat, and the loss of that person, so sudden, so brutal, so utterly beyond his control, became the wound that shaped every version of the man he later became. He blamed himself for not being strong enough, old enough, capable enough to save them. And that guilt, festering beneath the surface, hardened into a philosophy that weakness should be punished, not protected, because in his mind, weakness had cost him the only person who had ever loved him without condition. The pain of that loss didn't fade. It calcified, turning into the coldness that employees mistook for arrogance, turning into the discipline that executives feared, turning into the emotional armor he crafted so meticulously that even he forgot there had been a time when he was gentle, hopeful, and capable of being hurt. His obsession with perfection, his intolerance for mistakes, his refusal to show vulnerability, every trait we blamed on ambition was, in truth, a shield forged from the fear of ever feeling that level of loss again. And as I watched him tremble now, confronted by a child who had unknowingly spoken the one phrase tied to his deepest scar, I understood that he wasn't reacting to the girl. He was reacting to the memory she had awakened, the memory of the person he had failed to protect, the memory he had buried beneath decades of achievement and intimidation, believing that success could silence grief. But the past does not stay buried. It waits. And on this day, it finally caught him. His eyes flickered between the girl and the janitor, widening with a dawning horror that made the hairs on my arms rise, because in his expression I saw the unmistakable realization that this moment was not random, not accidental, not simply an outburst followed by an interruption. Something about the girl's presence, her courage, her words, was pulling together pieces of a puzzle he had never dared to touch, and the janitor, standing frozen, pale, and helpless, looked as though he understood that connection before any of us did. I felt a cold wave wash over me as the CEO staggered slightly, not from physical weakness but from the unbearable weight of recognition settling into his bones. And for the first time since the confrontation began, I sensed that the janitor's role in all of this was far deeper than a target of misplaced anger or an unfortunate witness to the CEO's unraveling. Because the connection between that memory and the janitor was even more shocking. When I learned what the janitor had been hiding for years, it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle the CEO never solved, a fragment of truth that had been silently circling him like a shadow he never recognized. And the moment those hidden pieces began falling into place, I felt a deep chill settle inside me, because I understood that nothing about this confrontation was accidental. Every thread of this story had been quietly weaving itself together long before any of us realized we were standing in the middle of it. The janitor stood frozen, his posture stiff, and his eyes filled with a fear that did not belong to a man afraid of losing his job or being yelled at again. Instead, it was the fear of someone who had spent years keeping a truth locked inside his chest, terrified of the consequences that would unfold the moment it escaped. And as I watched him look from the CEO to the girl and back again, it became painfully clear that he had recognized her long before the CEO had. His relationship to the CEO's past was not the kind built through corporate ladders or old professional ties. It was something far deeper, something older, something shaped long before either man stepped into this building. And when the girl reached for his hand, curling her small fingers around his calloused ones, the truth tugged at the edge of his expression, with the weight of a confession fighting its way to the surface. The janitor exhaled shakily, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that suggested years of suppressed emotion. And when he finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice carried a trembling honesty that made my throat tighten, because I realized then that he had not been silent out of passiveness, but out of necessity. He had known the CEO long before the CEO became the person we all feared, known him when he was still just a broken boy, trying to hide the cracks forming in the foundation of his world, known him back when life was brutal and unpredictable and merciless, and their paths had diverged at a moment so devastating that both men had carried the trauma like a quiet chain dragging behind them. He explained slowly at first, and then with a flood of painful clarity, that he had once been close to the CEO's family in ways that went far beyond the role of an outsider or neighbor. He had been a presence in the house during the years when chaos reigned and responsibilities collapsed onto young shoulders far too early, and he had witnessed firsthand the deep connection between the CEO and the younger person he had mentioned, the one whose loss carved a hollow space inside him that had never healed. Why he kept quiet all this time was not because he lacked the courage to speak, but because he believed that revealing himself would hurt the CEO more than it could ever help. And in his voice, I heard the kind of guilt that grows from watching a child suffer in silence and feeling powerless to intervene. He had stayed away from the CEO deliberately, not out of apathy, but out of a fear that resurfacing would drag the past into the present before the CEO was ready to face it, and perhaps before the consequences of telling the truth could be contained. He described struggles I had never imagined for a man who moved quietly through our hallways every day. Years spent working odd jobs to survive, years of trying to make amends for choices he never forgave himself for, years of sacrificing personal comfort to ensure the girl beside him had a chance at a better life, even if that life meant taking on burdens he was never meant to carry alone. His sacrifices were etched into his posture, into the lines on his face, into the tired heaviness he carried when he thought no one was watching. And I realized, with a sting of shame, that we had all dismissed him as insignificant because he swept floors and emptied bins, never once considering the depth of the life unfolding behind those quiet eyes. The emotional wounds he carried were not loud or obvious. They were subtle, heavy, and deeply ingrained, the kind that turn into lifelong shadows that follow every step a person takes. He spoke about promises he had failed to keep, about the grief that had shaped his adulthood, about the regret that lingered even after years of trying to do right. And as the CEO listened, still trembling, still pale, I saw something shift between them, something fragile and heartbreaking, as if two ghosts had finally recognized each other after years of wandering separate paths. The janitor's voice cracked when he confessed that he had kept the girl close, not just out of responsibility but out of love, out of loyalty to the same person the CEO had lost. And the girl tightened her hold on his hand, as though she knew exactly how heavy these words were, as though she had grown up hearing pieces of this story without ever understanding the full truth until this very moment. And as painful as it was to watch him unravel, I sensed that he was not confessing for himself, but for the girl standing beside him, because she deserved answers, she deserved truth, and she deserved freedom from a burden that was never meant to fall on her small shoulders. Yet even with all these revelations unfolding like a slow storm, breaking open the sky, one truth still remained hidden, pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat waiting to be heard, because the girl's role in all of this, her reason for being here, her connection to the CEO's past, was about to reveal a truth none of us expected. For the first time in his entire career, he wasn't talking like a leader. He was pleading like a man who finally understood his mistakes, a man who had spent years hiding behind power and authority, only to realize, in the most humiliating and heartbreaking way possible, that the walls he had built around himself had protected nothing but his own fear, leaving everyone around him wounded in ways he had never bothered to see. He took a shaky breath and stepped toward the janitor with a slowness that revealed just how heavy the moment felt on his shoulders. And when he opened his mouth, the word "sorry" slipped out in a fragile voice so unfamiliar that several people around me gasped quietly, because none of us had ever heard him apologize. Not once. Not even when he knew he was wrong. Not even when the consequences were severe enough to shake the company. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a hallway filled with employees who had feared him for years, offering an apology with eyes that trembled and a posture that seemed to fold in on itself. He didn't stop at the apology. He kept speaking, the words tumbling out with a desperation that suggested he was terrified of letting the silence return. Terrified that if he hesitated even for a second, the chance to repair what he had broken might slip away forever. He offered help, support, promises of financial security, health benefits, opportunities for the girl, apologies layered one on top of another. And I realized then that he wasn't bargaining with the janitor. He was begging the universe to give him a chance to rewrite the story he had spent decades refusing to confront. He said he wanted to fix things, to make amends for the pain he had caused, both knowingly and unknowingly. And for a moment I saw the man he could have been if life had not carved such deep wounds into him. A man capable of compassion, capable of remorse, capable of understanding that strength did not come from coldness but from the willingness to face the parts of himself he had buried. The emotional vulnerability pouring out of him was so raw, so unfiltered, that it left the entire room suspended in a kind of stunned silence. Because this version of him, this trembling, open, painfully human version, was something no one had imagined existed beneath the layers of intimidation and control. I watched executives who had once cowered in his presence wipe their eyes discreetly. I saw assistants lower their heads as if unable to witness the emotional unraveling of someone they had nearly deified. I even felt my own throat tighten, because for the first time since I met him, I saw a man instead of a machine. My perspective as I watched him soften felt strangely intimate, as though I were standing on the edge of a moment that would permanently alter every memory I carried of him. This newfound softness didn't look rehearsed or strategic or designed to win sympathy. It looked like the first time he had allowed his true self to breathe after years of suffocating beneath the persona he believed he needed to survive. And as I watched him reach out, not with authority but with trembling sincerity, I couldn't help imagining how different his life might have been if someone, anyone, had given him permission to feel this way sooner. But even as he spoke, even as he apologized, even as he opened his heart in front of a building full of people who had never thought him capable of vulnerability, the janitor did not move toward him. Instead, he stood in quiet stillness, his eyes lowered, his hand wrapped protectively around the girl's small fingers, and there was something in his silence that carried more weight than any outburst could have conveyed. When the CEO finally paused, breathless from emotion, waiting for forgiveness he desperately needed but did not know how to ask for, the janitor lifted his head slowly, revealing an expression so heavy, so sorrowful, that the air shifted again in a way that warned me the moment was about to turn. And then the janitor hesitated. Not because he wanted to refuse, not because he wanted revenge, but because he needed to tell the CEO something he never expected to hear. When the girl revealed the true meaning of what she said, the CEO looked as if the world had stopped moving, as if every sound in the building had collapsed into a single, suffocating silence that wrapped itself around him and refused to let him breathe. And in that suspended moment, I felt the heaviness of a truth so powerful that it seemed capable of reshaping every memory he had tried so hard to suppress. She stood between him and the janitor, her small fingers intertwined with the older man's trembling hand. And when she lifted her chin to speak, her voice did not carry anger or accusation, but a quiet steadiness that made the words fall more sharply than if she had shouted them. She explained that the sentence she had spoken, the one that had shattered the CEO's composure, was not something she had created or learned from a stranger. It was a message that had been passed down to her by someone who had loved her deeply, someone who had once whispered those same words during nights filled with fear, someone whose absence had carved an emptiness inside her life that she had never fully understood until now. As she spoke, the CEO's eyes widened with a dawning dread, and I could see memories colliding behind them. The childhood he had buried, the voice he had lost, the person whose name he had whispered moments earlier, because the girl explained that the phrase was something her guardian used to repeat to her whenever she cried, whenever she felt unsafe, whenever the world seemed too big to navigate alone. And that guardian, she revealed, had learned those words from someone else long before she was born. The connection between the CEO's past and the present twisted together so tightly that I felt the air grow colder, because the phrase she delivered so innocently had traveled across years of pain, across 2 generations of loss, carrying the same emotional imprint it had the night the CEO first heard it as a child, whispered by someone he vowed to protect, but ultimately could not save. When she said she had come here because her guardian once told her that if she was ever lost, ever frightened, ever unsure who to trust, she should find the man behind the name she had spoken, I saw the CEO's knees weaken, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that the very words he had associated with regret and failure had survived through another life, reshaped into a lifeline rather than a scar. The emotional release that followed was quiet but devastating. The CEO pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, as if trying to contain the avalanche of memories crashing through him, and the janitor's eyes filled with tears he fought hard to hide, because the truth that bound all 3 of them together was no longer something any of them could ignore. Shock rippled through the hallway, but beneath the shock was something softer. A recognition that this moment had been waiting to surface for years, held together by pain none of them had known how to name. The girl stepped forward and, with a bravery that did not match her age, explained why she had intervened. She had heard the CEO shouting and felt the same fear she once felt whenever her guardian spoke of the past. And she believed, without knowing the history, that the words she carried might stop the anger before it became something irreversible, because those words had always been spoken to comfort, not to wound. And as she finished speaking, she revealed one final truth, a truth that settled over the room like a new kind of silence, a truth that reshaped the CEO's understanding of everything he believed. He stood frozen between who he used to be and who he could become, and the decision he made would alter all our lives. Because in that moment he was not the CEO who ruled with precision and fear, nor the broken man haunted by a memory he had spent decades locking away, but someone suspended on the fragile edge of transformation, caught between the armor he had built and the humanity he had abandoned. And I watched him tremble beneath the weight of a choice that demanded he confront everything he had ever tried to forget. His eyes moved slowly from the girl to the janitor, and then back to the polished floor beneath his shoes, as if he needed something solid to anchor himself before he shattered completely. And the silence that filled the hallway grew thick with the tension of a man fighting against instincts that had defined him for a lifetime. Pride had always been his shield, the invisible force that propelled him forward even when he was bleeding internally, and redemption was the one path he had never allowed himself to consider, not because he believed he didn't deserve it, but because he feared what would happen if he admitted how badly he needed it. I could see the struggle unfold inside him, not through dramatic gestures, but through the small betrayals of his composure, the uneven rise and fall of his chest, the tremor in his jaw as he clenched it too tightly, the tightness around his eyes as he tried to swallow emotions that had lived dormant inside him for years. I felt something tighten in my own chest as I watched him, because even though I had stood beside him through countless storms of his own creation, I had never seen him face one that required such brutal honesty, and witnessing his vulnerability made me realize that strength had never abandoned him. He had abandoned strength the day he convinced himself that feeling anything was a weakness. My emotional reaction was heavier than I expected, a mix of disbelief, empathy, and a strange, aching hope that he might finally allow himself to be the man he could have been if life had not carved its hardest lessons into him so young. I found myself silently urging him toward the choice that would heal rather than destroy, even though I knew that choosing redemption would demand a courage he had rarely shown in any boardroom, because this time the battle was not with competitors or deadlines, but with his own reflection, his own guilt, his own fear of facing the truth he had smothered beneath a lifetime of authority. He lifted his head slowly, his gaze settling once again on the janitor and the girl, and in that expression I saw the moment the internal war reached its breaking point, the moment he realized he could no longer hide behind the identity he had built to protect himself from the pain of losing the one person who had once depended on him. His shoulders softened, his breath steadied, and the coldness that had defined him for so long began to melt into something gentler, something uncertain, something painfully earnest. His final decision did not come as a sudden declaration, but as a quiet, fragile shift in posture. He stepped toward the janitor and the girl, not with the authority of a man used to commanding the world, but with the humility of someone who finally understood that healing required the kind of courage he had denied himself for decades. The apology he repeated was softer now, deeper, shaped by a sincerity that reached beyond the words themselves. And when he offered not power or solutions, but presence, the entire room seemed to exhale as though witnessing the impossible become real. The staff watched in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something bordering on reverence, because no one had ever imagined that the man who once treated vulnerability as a flaw would stand before two people he had wronged, directly or indirectly, and choose compassion over pride. Some employees covered their mouths, others lowered their eyes, and a few stared with the wide-eyed astonishment of people who knew They had just witnessed a moment that would be whispered about for years. And when he finally chose, none of us were prepared for the consequences. What began as a public humiliation turned into a moment that reshaped the CEO, the janitor, and the little girl forever. Because the confrontation that started with raised voices and fear transformed into something none of us could have predicted. A quiet, trembling rebirth of three people whose lives had been tangled in pain long before fate decided to pull them into the same room on that strange and unforgettable morning. In the days that followed, their relationship shifted in ways so gentle and yet so profound that I sometimes found myself standing in a hallway or sitting at my desk, unable to fully grasp how quickly everything had changed. Because the CEO, who had once ruled through intimidation and distance, began showing a softness that had always existed beneath his armor but had never been allowed to surface. And the janitor, who had spent years hiding guilt he should never have carried alone, began to walk with a dignity that suggested the weight on his shoulders had finally begun to lift. The CEO's emotional healing did not arrive in a dramatic wave, but in slow, steady steps that required him to confront the childhood he had denied for decades. He met with the girl and the janitor outside the office, not as a leader trying to solve a problem, but as a man trying to untangle the knots inside his own heart. I watched him sit beside the little girl in the cafeteria one afternoon, speaking to her in a voice that barely resembled the tone he used with executives, a voice shaped by curiosity instead of control, warmth instead of dominance, grief instead of fear. He asked about her life, her memories, her guardian, and when she answered, I saw a fragile tenderness appear in his expression, the kind born when someone realizes that pain can travel across years and still find a new shape in someone else's story. He apologized again to the janitor, not in the rushed, desperate way he had done before, but in a calm, deliberate tone that suggested he finally understood the depth of the hurt he had inflicted, both through his anger that morning and through the years of distance he had kept between himself and the truth of their shared past. The janitor, in turn, accepted the apology with a quiet grace that felt like a release, as though both men had spent far too long carrying burdens that never belonged to just one of them. The janitor's dignity, once crushed beneath the CEO's outburst, returned with a strength that surprised even him. People in the office began treating him differently, not out of pity, but out of respect, because they had witnessed a man who stood at the center of a storm, not of his making, and still found the courage to remain kind, gentle, and steady. And the CEO, to his credit, ensured that the janitor never again felt invisible within the company, not through grand gestures but through consistent acknowledgement. Greetings in the hallway, conversations outside his office, moments of genuine recognition that suggested a man learning, slowly but earnestly, how to be human again. As for the girl, she became an unexpected thread stitching the three of them together. She visited the office occasionally, not as a symbol of the confrontation, but as a quiet reminder of the truth that had pulled each of them back into themselves. She would hold the janitor's hand and speak to the CEO with the ease of a child who understood, without knowing how or why, that her words had awakened something long protected and long denied. And the CEO, each time he looked at her, carried an expression that blended grief for the past with hope for the future, as though she had become both a reminder of what he had lost and a compass guiding him toward a version of himself he never believed he could reclaim. Watching the three of them together felt like watching a wound close. Not perfectly, not without scars, but with a kind of healing that allowed breath to return where it had once been trapped beneath sorrow. I found myself reflecting often on how easily a single moment can unravel or rebuild a life, how one child's courage could shatter decades of silence, how one man's remorse could soften a lifetime of hardness, and how one janitor's quiet strength could carry more truth than the words of 100 executives. And even now, when I walk past the hallway where it began, I can still feel the echo of that morning lingering in the air, a reminder that transformation rarely arrives gently, but always arrives when it is meant to. And her words still echo inside me, as if they were meant for my life too. If this story moved you the way it moved me while telling it, share the moment that hit your heart the hardest, because your voice shapes every story that follows.